Welcome everyone to today's hybrid event, Emerging Opportunities for MedTech Sector Engagement in Singapore. It is a pleasure to be joined both virtually and in person with you all. Thank you for joining us. My name is Miko Montalibano and I'm the manager for Asialink Business Partnerships and Development. Before we begin today's proceeding, I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation as the traditional custodians of this land where we are meeting in person today. I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters of New South Wales. In terms of housekeeping, I would like to mention that the event will be recorded. It will be live streamed and recorded. Also, for guests joining us online, during the Q&A session that we're going to have after the panel discussion, I would encourage you to use the Q&A function on your screens to submit your questions. We will endeavor to answer as many questions as we can. Asialink Business is pleased to partner with Investment New South Wales on this exciting event, as our mission at Asialink is to drive creative engagement between Australia and Asia to build a strong shared future. We are pleased to have the following speakers to join us this afternoon. We have Carla Lampe, Director, Global Markets, Investment New South Wales. Joining us virtually, we have Janice Goh, Trade and Investment Director, based in Singapore for Investment New South Wales. We also have Del Kingsford-Smith, Vice President for Medical Affairs, Market Access, and Government Affairs for Asia Pacific for Cochlear. Last but not least, we have John Kelly, the founder and CEO of Atomo Diagnostics. Welcome to our distinguished panel. I'd now like to introduce Carla Lampe, Director of Global Markets, Investment New South Wales, to provide our opening remarks.
Thank you, Miko, and good afternoon to you all here on a rainy Sydney day, and also good afternoon to our friends and colleagues joining us online. Miko, like you, I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are standing today and pay our respects to their elders past, present and future. I'd also like to acknowledge Del and John, esteemed colleagues. Both thank you so much for your time and for the expertise that you're going to share with us during the panel, and as well to Janice, joining us from Singapore, and recognising that our friends and colleagues in Singapore at the moment are facing a really challenging time. So our thoughts are with you. Miko mentioned Investment New South Wales, and I just wanted to spend a bit of time talking to you about that and how we can help you. The Premier recently announced the establishment of Investment New South Wales, and really the reason behind that is to consolidate all of the trade and investment initiatives that the government has across the state into a one-stop shop to help businesses. So to help businesses to export, to encourage investment, and to really grow the New South Wales economy for the benefit of all of us here today. So as part of Investment New South Wales, we are also growing our footprint internationally. So we're here today talking about opportunities for New South Wales businesses into Singapore, and part of our Investment New South Wales remit is to roll out additional resources in key markets, including Singapore, to help you. So we are here both in Sydney and also in Singapore. Please reach out to us after this conversation if you'd like to give us some feedback around how we can help you access the market. Are there lessons that we can share with you around doing business in the key markets that we're talking about, but also in Singapore today. I won't spend any more time taking up your time today, because I know we've got a really insightful discussion learning about how our health and medtech companies in New South Wales, who have done so well in helping us through the last 18 months, how we can take that capability and expertise onto the global stage. So with that, I'll hand back over to you. Thanks, Miko.
Thank you, Carla, for those opening remarks. And I'm personally excited about the international expansion of Investment New South Wales and how you can support SMEs, startups, and other companies to, in particular, MedTech exporting in Singapore. Perfect. I'd now like to formally introduce our distinguished panel for this afternoon. and give a brief background of each of their companies. I would just like to ask our panelists, as I introduce you, can you please take your seat in the front area of our venue. The first person I'd like to introduce is Del Kingsford-Smith. Del is the Vice President for Medical Affairs, Market Access, and Government Affairs for Asia Pacific and Cochlear. Cochlear, as we all know, is a global leader in implantable hearing solutions, having provided more than 600,000 implantable devices to people with hearing loss worldwide. It has over 4,000 staff worldwide, and its global headquarters is right here in Sydney in Macquarie Park. It maintains regional headquarters in Asia Pacific, Europe, and the Americas, and has 4 manufacturing sites around the world. Cochlear invests over $160 million annually towards research and development, and has a 300-strong team of engineers whose passion is to make the lives of people with hearing loss much easier. Welcome, Del. The second panelist I'd like to introduce is John Kelly, founder and CEO of Atomo Diagnostics. Atomo Diagnostics is a medical device manufacturer headquartered right here in Sydney in Leichhardt, with offices in South Africa and the United Kingdom. In 2014, its Atomo Rapid HIV blood testing kit, part of its revolutionary Atomo Rapid blood testing platform, won Best in Show at the Medical Device Excellence Awards. Also in 2014, Atomo was named Australian Emerging Company of the Year by Johnson & Johnson Innovation. More recently, the company expanded into COVID testing with its COVID-19 antibody test kit. The company is committed to increasing the early detection and ongoing treatment of infectious and chronic diseases by making testing safer, more accurate, and more accessible. Welcome, John. Last but not least, and joining us virtually, we have Janice Goh, the Trade and Investment Director for Investment New South Wales, based in Singapore. As part of Investment New South Wales' strategy, Singapore will act as the hub for the Southeast Asia region in promoting trade and investment for New South Wales. Janice has extensive experience in trade and investment and has experience also working with small and medium enterprise and startups. Her portfolio includes the key growth areas of health, agribusiness and food, resources, infrastructure, and technology. Welcome, Janice. So I would now like to kick off the formal portion of our event this afternoon. And I will pose a question to both Del and John, and maybe I'll have John be the first one to answer. And it's really a discussion around exporting. And the context of this is that in our pre-event survey, we had several attendees online and in person indicate that they are new to the exporting business. They are either in the medtech sector or related sector and are very interested in going about exporting. Can I ask both John and Del to talk about exporting? What are the key considerations in figuring out how to sell your products overseas?
Yeah, no, great question. I mean, I think the Australian population is less than 1% of the global population, and medical devices typically take a lot of capital and investment to get to market. So I think it's inherent that export forms a part of any go-to-market plan, and Atomo sells more than 90% of its products overseas. So developing and executing a good export-driven plan is critical. I think there are obviously big opportunities in markets like Europe and the US, but cost of market entry becomes a challenge if you're not well capitalized. Atomo focused its first solution on HIV, and we were very lucky to get some impact investment that allowed us to launch into the South African market, and we really used that as a flagship to then generate further agreements outside of South Africa. So I think being successful in one market is a really good way to kind of establish your technology and then use that to roll out into bigger markets that might be more expensive to enter directly.
Excellent. Thanks, John. And Del, I might pose the same question to you. Exporting from a Cochlear perspective, what are the key considerations?
Well, I think I would agree completely with John on, and the way I would add on to that is that Cochlear had a strategy from day one, and the strategy is actually really important, and that was a global strategy from day one for the reason that Australia is a very small market, and even though we are heavily invested in in New South Wales and in Queensland as well. Our R&D is done here, our manufacturing is done here, but our markets are elsewhere. So we had global from day one as the strategy. I think the next thing to think about is which markets do you go to? The world has 210, John, 214, very large number of places you could choose to go. So you need to have a strategy about which of those, and for Cochlear, which is a complex technology for a low prevalence condition, not hearing loss itself is a high prevalence condition, but we work at the severe to profound end of the hearing loss, congenitally deaf babies, and progressive hearing loss in later life. So we had to choose markets where there was the infrastructure, the healthcare system, the regulatory system, etc., that would support the complex technology and its successful use in patients who needed it. I think the third thing, and I think we're going to cover this a little bit more later, is about your selling model. Thinking about where you're going to go, it's also about how you're going to go there, and that's not just about market entry, that's about actually, you might start off as a distributor, your selling model is through distributors, but you might then almost evolve into a more direct selling model. So it's about thinking about how that model works. For example, now Cochlear is direct in 30-something markets, but we have multiple distributor agreements around the world. And then I think probably the fourth thing that is quite important to think about is how you support your product. So getting it there and getting it used, but for Cochlear, if a baby is implanted with a Cochlear implant, that's a lifelong commitment. And life for these babies born now could be 100. So how do you support that technology over time? How do you repair things? How do you replace things? Is not an insignificant consideration as well.
Certainly, certainly. And we can talk more about the distributor model. I think, Del, it's really a phased approach, isn't it? You go from a certain phase with using distributor only, and then going direct, and obviously.
And that's one of your strategies, yes.
Right. Yes. Perfect. I would like now to talk to Janice and ask Janice to talk about the trends you're seeing, obviously in Singapore, but also maybe in the Southeast Asia region within MedTech, and then also expand on what are the opportunities for New South Wales companies what are those trends that might lead to opportunities for exporters here?
Thank you, Miko. So I noticed that a lot of new exporters joining us on this call. So for the benefit of new exporters, let me just quickly touch on Singapore's trends in terms of health and a quick background. So healthcare in Singapore is actually managed by the Ministry of Health, and funding for the public healthcare system is actually based on the principle that the patient always pays part of the cost of treatment. So in terms of regulatory authority, Health Sciences Authority, HSA for short, actually regulates the import, the manufacture, and the licensing of medical devices in Singapore. So our national healthcare spending is about 5% of GDP in 2020, and it's actually quite low among developed countries, but it's expected to grow as our population ages. So in terms of the key trends we see here in Singapore, number one is, of course, aging population. So one of the key trends that we are seeing is that more than 1 in 4 Singaporeans will be above 65 years old. This is due to increasing life expectancy together with falling rate. So what this means is that you can actually expect to see more spending from the government's end. And we have recently in the budget committed to actually building up more public healthcare facilities. And this might be an opportunity because more facilities equals to more spending. And I think in terms of agency, we also have agency for integrated care for the needs of social as well as health services for seniors. And the other trend that we are seeing is that there is increase in the prevalence of chronic diseases. So think about diabetes, hypertension, high cholesterol, and even obesity. So people used to joke that these are like developed or rich countries' problem, and we are seeing this as well. because what we are doing now is that it actually shapes our policy, our healthcare policy, where the government actually emphasizes on healthy lifestyle and a focus on preventive care. Again, this presents opportunity for companies looking at diagnostics and preventive medtech or healthcare. So the Singapore government actually launched a few initiatives, one of which we have the Singapore Step Challenge, where you can win prizes just by walking 10,000 steps a day. So these are really like government initiatives to encourage a healthy lifestyle. And the third trend that we are actually seeing here is that there is an increasingly digitalized lifestyle and also the use of technology and innovation in healthcare. So Singapore has embarked on a smart nation strategy. And what this means is that we are working to create a technological-driven, up-to-date healthcare system with the capacity to ensure the well-being of our citizens. So think about things like healthcare mobile applications, robotics, digitizing your personal data, your transaction, as well as your healthcare data. So another example would be we have a health hub, which is developed by MOH, which is a one-stop portal where you can actually access your health information and make appointments with doctors. And we are also piloting solutions in AI, robotics for assertive care, as well as prediction and management of chronic diseases. And also we see trends like telehealth for consultation and rehab. So I think these are all trends that are shaping the opportunities for our New South Wales exporters.
Great, thanks, Janice. If I were to summarize that for you, it sounds like it's a combination of government policy, government spending in healthcare. You also have the demographic picture with people living longer lifespans and the diseases that come with that. And then you have the investment in technology as well that's helping to bring these types of products into the market successfully. Thank you for that. Janice, I'm going to stay with you for a moment. Can I also ask you, and again, the context here is we have in our online audience, people are obviously interested in Singapore, and that's the focal point. But again, from the Singapore perspective, how is Singapore, the medtech sector, how does it size up against other markets in Southeast Asia, in particular, I guess, developed markets like Thailand and Malaysia?
Yeah, so I mean, we are often called Singapore as a hub, and we recognize that we do face competition from neighboring countries, like you said, Thailand and Malaysia. And these countries are actually competing on cost as well as accessibility. So for Thailand, you can think about rising medical tourism as well. And Malaysia, it's a cheaper hub for manufacturing. But if you were to look at Singapore in terms of, like, for example, the Fitch Asia Pacific Medical Devices Risk and Reward Index, you actually find that Singapore ranked very highly ahead of these countries due to our first, strong IP, second, our transparent regulatory environment, and third, our lower operational risk. So I think a lot of companies, and I think Dale will speak more about that later, also use Singapore as a hub and spoke model where they actually have a regional HQ in Singapore, perhaps some manufacturing facility, and into the region. So I think it's a good regional distribution center. And in terms of if you are looking at manufacturing in Singapore, a lot of companies also leverage on our strong design and engineering capabilities, as well as our strong base of automation supplies and high quality assurance standards. So I think, yes, the competition is rising, but I think I may be biased, but we are well equipped to deal with it.
Excellent, Janice. And I'm glad you mentioned the concept of using Singapore as a hub in Southeast Asia, because we'll get to discuss that in a bit. I'm going to turn back to my in-person panel, Del and John, and talk about Singapore more in particular and how Singapore fits in both your company's regional strategy or global strategy. We talked a little bit about this, the hub argument as well, but maybe just talk about the merits of Singapore. Why did you decide to locate in Singapore? And maybe I'll switch it up, Del, and maybe ask you the question first.
And it is a great question, and I fully agree with Janice's great advertisement for Singapore. It is a place that Cochlear has invested as a hub for the ASEAN region. In fact, it is our hub from Pakistan, as Sri Lanka. It's an eight-country hub. So why do we choose that? I think the point about the regulatory environment, the certainty of the stability of the country. The other thing that I think companies need to think about is the way that they attract talent as well. And Singapore is a place that, for an Australian company where we're very English speaking, Singapore is a great hub for individuals. It has a big expatriate community. So I'm thinking about our hub in Singapore, which is in Novena Square. We have 15 people in that office. Some are based in and focused completely on Singapore as a market in its own right, but 10 of them are focused on the fly-in, we call fly-in, fly-out, to service those other countries. So we can be very efficient. I'm thinking about the individuals in that office. We have one who has rotated in from India. We have others that have come from other parts from Australia, from other parts of Asia. And for them to be in Singapore is a safe place. It is a great transport hub as well, so that it's easy to get from place to place. And it's an attractive place for talent to be. So it's not just about the regulatory environment and the stability and the warehousing and the safety and the IP protection. It's also about how you move your people around. If you're a global company and you want to have a talent program, then it is a great hub in that respect.
Thanks, Del. John, I'm going to probe a little bit and maybe put you in the hot seat, because we've heard two great arguments for Singapore as a hub. We're talking, this panel is really going to discuss medtech opportunities for New South Wales exporters. Can you talk about Singapore as a market, particularly maybe from Atomo Diagnostics' perspective?
Yeah, no, certainly. I mean, I think the biggest drawback of Singapore obviously is the population. On an Asian scale, it's quite a small population, just less than 5 million. But I think what it does, it's kind of again this idea of a beachhead in Asia. I think if you can get sales in Singapore, that carries a lot of credibility in the ASEAN region. When we engage with different distributors in Singapore, they quite often say, you know, if we can do a deal for Singapore, we've got an associate in Malaysia, we've got an affiliate in Thailand. So, you know, deals in Singapore tend to spread out. They've got a lot of tentacles in the region. So I think it's a good, I think hub's the word, but in terms of sort of commercial networks, it seems to be the epicenter of finance. It's an easy place to do business. You know, your proprietary know-how and contractual rights are respected there in a way that they aren't to the same degree in a lot of other Asian markets. So I think it's a low-risk market entry spot. And that market might only be 5 million, but that market then leverages you into other contracts in much larger populations, albeit maybe not as easy to get into. I think the other benefit of Singapore is it delivers a kind of developed market premium that you don't get in some of these other markets as well. So it is a relatively, you know, wealthy country by Asian standards, and I think that allows you to generate some margin when you look to enter that market.
Excellent. John, I'm going to stay with you and get on the topic of, you know, Del brought it up about a phased approach, and Atomo Diagnostics, I understand right now, is using the distributor model. Can you talk a little bit about how you see that evolving, maybe how to get to the direct market at some point in the future? I mean,
but building your own sales and marketing infrastructure is a very expensive organic process, and unless you've got sales and profitability to underpin that, it becomes very difficult. You know, you can't be a startup with 300 salespeople around the world. You just can't pay the wages. So obviously a distributor-led model is a low-cost way to enter. The downside being you obviously share margin with that distributor for that effort. But you know, that's really the only practical way to do it, unless you want to license your technology to a large multinational. And a lot of Australian companies do that because in some ways it seems like the easy route, but you then give over control. You have difficulty extracting yourself from those types of licensing arrangements. So I think distributor type models are a sort of happy medium between carrying the full SG&A commitment yourself versus handing over the control and a lot of the value to a large multinational, and it's a fine balance. And then obviously when a market becomes big enough to be sustainable, you can look to, you know, start to build maybe your own targeted infrastructure in key markets, but it's never going to make sense to have 3 sales guys in Ukraine. So that's where the distributor model, I think, is a long-term solution even for the big guys.
Yeah, and there's also, between those two, the direct and the distributor model, there's what we have in some of our markets, which is a hybrid model, where you have worked through a distributor, but you have some Cochlear employees in that country that do specific things, help manage the distributors. Some of them might be sales and marketing, and so, but mainly marketing. So it's the value add and that helps us with that. Some of it also is about managing our professionals, our surgeons. So I think a hybrid model can actually be a step to you can do it step by step rather than going from 0 to 10.
Great. Del, I'd now like to ask you about Cochlear's interaction with the Singapore government in expanding, using Singapore as a hub, but also potentially as a market. Janice quoted a couple of agencies that are very prominent that are promoting, obviously, healthcare technology in Singapore. Can you talk a little bit about Cochlear's work in that field?
Yes, and we have had a very good experience in Singapore. I have to say, it is a developed market, as John said, so it is a market that the region looks to as an advanced market and early adopters. I think the Ministry of Health has a very significant influence on policy, and I note Janice's discussion about the decreased birth rate and the increase in the ageing population. For us, understanding that policy and interacting with the Ministry of Health was very important, because they're very interested in increasing productivity, keeping people working for longer. When you have fewer younger resources, you then look towards keeping your individuals in the workforce longer. China is doing the same thing. And that means that they need to hear well in order to be fully functioning. So there are ways, if you understand the policy environment, to be able to enter into a very fruitful dialogue with the Ministry of Health in Singapore, and we've done that. There's also a Health Technology Assessment Agency, which is a sub-agency of the Ministry of Health that assesses the value of your product and its price. And again, having good relationships with that organisation is also very important, and understanding where they're coming from in terms of how you develop your product.
Certainly. John, your experience with working with the Singapore government, obviously the context here is Atomo Diagnostics is a relatively new company.
Yeah.
Cochlear has been around for quite a while,
Yeah,
but you've won innovation awards in health technology. How has that helped you, and what were your dealings with government?
Our dealings with the Singaporean government specifically have not been overly extensive. I mean, we have had a good reception when we've engaged with them. We've had some engagement with Temasek on the investment and development side, and they've helped facilitate some discussions with MedTech institutional investors. Yes. So our engagement with the government's been quite light, but what I can say is the engagement we've had with them has been very streamlined, very efficient and encouraging from a business kind of doing business perspective. So I think that they're very professional to deal with, and they obviously have a free market economy, which means they're there to facilitate engagement rather than dictate it. And I think that's quite encouraging. From a smaller company perspective, we need that flexibility.
Yes. Yeah. Janice, we've heard a lot of good arguments and good points for why Singapore is a great place for a company out of New South Wales in the medtech sector to look at as an export market, whether it be as a market on its own or as a hub for a broader regional ASEAN or Southeast Asia strategy. Can you talk about the role in particular of Investment New South Wales, how you can support any aspiring exporters who want to enter the Singapore market?
Sure. So at Investment New South Wales, I'm here in market to help you guys, especially new companies as well as companies that want to expand into Singapore. And we do have a wide array of programs as well as grants to help companies like yourself. So in terms of, if you were to look at the New South Wales perspective, we do have programs like Trade Start program, where we work with Austrade to actually build a network of advisors that can, if you're not ready yet, help you to get market ready. prepare your export plans together with you. And of course, if when you're ready, we do have export assistance grant where you can get reimbursements for export marketing as well as development. And of course, at the federal level, we also have funds as well as schemes such as like your MedTech Research Fund, your R&D tax incentives, as well as entrepreneurs programs and BioMedTech Horizons program. And we also have the Health Medical Devices Fund. So really, depending on whether you're looking at market access or R&D, we also have assistance for you. So, I mean, I know I'm speaking a lot and that's a handful of schemes, but do reach out to us. We'll provide an email to you later if you need more information on the grants as well as the requirements for the grants.
Thanks, Janice. As Janice mentioned, we're happy to provide an email address where exporters or people who are interested in exporting to the Singapore market would want to request a bit more information on how to go about doing that with support from Investment New South Wales. With that, I would like to now turn to the Q&A session where we can involve our in-person audience as well as our virtual audience. And just a reminder, with our virtual audience, there's a Q&A function on your screen that you can click on to submit your questions. They'll make its way to us here. Somebody will pass me the questions. But maybe I'd like to first turn the floor over to our in-person audience. Are there any questions based on what our panelists have discussed? If not, I'll go on to our first question from our online audience. And I'll direct this first to Del. Could you share a mistake you made when expanding into the Singapore market, and what have you learned from it? How have you adapted? And this is a question asked by several online participants.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think it's one of the difficulties, and John brought it up too, is like how quickly do you expand and how quickly do you think about the market as a market and also the size of your hub and how you constitute your hub. And that, I think, was where we did have some learnings early on about where you put resource and how that resource then interacts with the rest of the region. So I think you can, it's hard when you've made that investment to pull back and change that. I think that's probably the learning, and I'm not sure how you overcome that, because unless you put a little bit of a stake in the ground, maybe you just have to learn as you go and make your adjustments. But certainly knowing what resource to put in and what infrastructure to put in to the hub that we have was something that we had a little trial and error over.
Sure. Over how many years was that? Do you think before you got the model right?
Look, I think the model changes all the time as it adapts to the different requirements and the maturity of different markets. Let me think about that one.
Okay.
Can I?
Sure, no worries. John?
Well, no specific mistakes with regard to Singapore, but more broadly, I think with the appointment of distributors, you know, it's always a risk to some degree. They typically want exclusivity, and the justification is they've got to put time and effort and resources into growing a product category, especially in our case when it's innovative and new and disruptive. But then when you hand over exclusivity, if they don't deliver, it can be quite a while before you can then take that technology back, and there's cost and lost opportunity. So I think the appointment of distributors is critical. When you're a small company without a track record, we have one now, but back then we didn't. You can't always be very choosy in some markets with who you can partner with. So I think that's a risk. We've decided not to go into some markets because we couldn't find the right partner. And I think one of my learnings is not always feeling we have to do a deal. Sometimes no deal is better than a bad deal, and I think I learned that the hard way in a few countries, but now we're a lot more choosy with who we partner with.
Yeah.
Right.
I think that's a really good point, John, because I'm just thinking about the way we've won into a couple of markets in ASEAN. A cochlear implant is not just something that you implant and forget. It requires rehabilitation. It requires ongoing maintenance. And so our distributors need to have effectively a service arm. And that makes it, again, to your point, sometimes it's about not going somewhere if you don't have the right infrastructure to make your product successful. So that is a big consideration depending the complexity of your technology.
Would you recommend for our audience, if you're going to a new market for the first time, exclusive or non-exclusive? Maybe John.
Well, it's difficult to say. I mean, non-exclusives preferred contractually, but then there's maybe a lack of commitment from the other partner. What I would say is really, I would encourage people to go to that country and spend some time there. Pick it in a distributor over a list on the web. That's a recipe for trouble.
Sure.
So you got to go there, you got to meet them, you got to meet their customers, you got to meet some of their ex-product suppliers to make sure they've done a good job. I think if you don't do your homework, you can quite easily find the wrong partner.
Yeah.
Certainly. Next question from the audience. What are the factors that have led to growth in the Singapore market in MedTech? And maybe I'll pose this to Janice. And Janice, you spoke about this a little bit earlier, but maybe just reiterate the key things that the government had done, obviously, that are really leading to the growth in MedTech sector there.
Yeah, I think the government here is actually very active in shaping policies and also to position ourselves as a hub. So for instance, on the R&D front, the government has built such an ecosystem that it's public and private collaboration. So we have an ecosystem of top universities, hospitals, your research institutions, your corporate labs, as well as startups. So in terms of this, we're actually trying to anchor an innovation system so that when you think of research, when you think of trialing, when you think of clinical trials, you will think of Singapore. And I think the other thing that might be interesting for some of the companies here, especially startups, are that we are also one of the hub for raising funds. So just last year alone, we had one of the largest number of health and medtech deals in Asia. And I think the total deal value actually reached about $2.3 billion, where 300 companies were funded. And another example of how government actually steps in is where Enterprise Singapore, they actually work closely with private players to provide early stage incubation support as well. So one example of a health medtech incubator would be Trendlines Medical, and they actually managed to incubate more than 8 medtech startups within these past 2 years. So I think it's really a combination of private players as well as government support that help to shape this whole ecosystem.
And I'd also like to add to that what John had mentioned, the role of Temasek, which is their sovereign wealth fund, helping companies, overseas companies enter the market, make the right introductions, and perhaps even put in investment capital into those companies that are coming into Singapore is also quite a big argument for expanding into MedTech in that country. Next question: what's the panelists' experience been in engaging with distributors in Singapore virtually? That's an interesting angle. Any tips? And obviously, the background here is it's COVID. John, you explained to us the pitfalls of not doing your due diligence with distributors, but now you've got an added challenge. You have to do it virtually. How would you go about it?
Really good question, and obviously, if you can't travel, being there in person becomes very difficult. But I think references are hugely important in terms of making sure distributors have the right bona fides to be a partner in country. Some track record with that class of product. A lot of people, we have the most user-friendly COVID test available. Everyone wanted to distribute COVID tests. So, if your background is in a different part of healthcare or possibly even not healthcare at all, then that doesn't make you a suitable partner. So I think having a track record in that segment, the connectivity and access to the right key opinion leaders, I think that's critical. And if, a distributor is providing more than sales, they're providing a kind of outsourced business development capability, and that includes clinical support, corporate and marketing, and they need to be able to prove they can do that. And a lot of that can be verified remotely, through Zoom and online.
Yes. Del, any tips on how to?
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about it more from a mature distributor relationship, and we had to just embrace change and do things differently. So we do a lot of training with our distributors and an ongoing continuing education, and we had to do that in a hybrid way, a virtual way. We might have been able to have someone in the country with them. The rest of it was streamed in. So we've become a lot more sophisticated, and I think that will never go away now, is that we will have a lot more interactions that are not face-to-face.
Yes.
And they will, as long as we set out to have the quality that a face-to-face provides, then we can continue to do that. But it was, for the first period of COVID, it was extremely challenging.
Yes.
Until we basically embraced the change.
Well, I think it's encouraging what you just said. You can do a hybrid model of sorts and engaging with people. And then to John's point, there are certain parameters that you can actually still do the due diligence online to arrive at sort of not as informed a decision in an in-person environment, but still nevertheless, still enough due diligence to make a well-informed business decision. Yeah. Maybe I can open it up to the audience again, our in-person audience, for a question.
Is it work on? Okay. Hi. My question is about telehealth in Singapore and whether or not, in Singapore you would often get, I guess they're called medical tourists, people seeking healthcare services in Singapore. And with telehealth, do you expect that Singapore would also serve other countries like Malaysia, like Thailand, via telehealth?
Janice, I might pose that question to you. I don't know if you heard it all, but the question is about telehealth. What's the status of the telehealth market in Singapore? And can you leverage a Singapore platform for telehealth to other neighboring countries?
Yeah, so I think telehealth is actually a very hot topic now because of COVID, and it actually expedited the growth of the industry. And if you look at Singaporeans in general, or people in Singapore, we are actually quite savvy with a lot of things like smartphones and wearables. So I think in terms of telehealth, a lot of MedTech as well as telehealth companies are leveraging on these technologies, the consumers' technologies, to actually use telehealth to target the audience. And if you were to think about it from the regional perspective, traditionally, Singapore is actually one of the leader in medical tourism. And even with COVID, for very important or critical cases, you can actually write in and appeal and actually travel here. So if you think about it, the whole ecosystem is actually supporting the growth of telehealth as well. And I think the research actually shows that the industry actually grew by 20%. So, in conclusion, I think there is definitely an opportunity here. And if you want to, you can actually leverage the existing ecosystem as well as the Smart Nation initiatives, because the government itself is also piloting telehealth, especially in areas like rehab and the more non-emergency areas. So I think definitely there's an opportunity here.
Has there been any case studies, Janice, of telehealth technologies or applications that have been born out of Singapore's innovation ecosystem and then applied in markets like Indonesia, which is a close neighbor, or Malaysia?
Yeah, I think the recent example is that aside from Zoom, they actually managed to get an app so that you can actually track your heart rate as well as your vitals from the smartwatch, things like your Samsung or Apple Watch. And then you can actually get the doctor to actually assess your condition. And I think another popular application is for health checkup, because health checkup is a big industry and it's not really life and death, right? It's just a checkup. So a lot of telehealth operators are actually targeting that. And the first target audience will be Singapore, but of course, slowly going into the region as well.
Great. Any other questions from the in-person gentleman?
My name is Jörg Klug. I'm an independent consultant. Quick question. We heard from Janice that Singapore has got a very rich ecosystem in terms of investment, but also government support and so on. Can you think of any situations where Singapore is a competitor to New South Wales and maybe some investment that would have gone into New South Wales otherwise was easier to obtain in Singapore and prompted businesses actually taking investment away from New South Wales to Singapore?
Great question.
Yeah, well, I think the answer invariably to that is yes. I mean, Singapore competes for capital and intellectual property and venture momentum, and I think it has some successes in that. I think one of its big benefits for a long time was a significantly lower corporate tax rate, and I think the recent patent box announcements here in Australia have leveled the playing field to some degree, and I think that's going to be hugely influential over the longer term. Unfortunately, it's not retrospective, so I don't think it's going to help anyone in the short term, but I think it's a step in the right direction. I think Singapore is a competitive place to do business, and a lot of companies go there when they choose a hub in Asia, and I think to some degree Sydney competes with Singapore at a multinational, transnational level. Yeah.
For Cochlear's core offering of hearing implantable devices, has there been any case where that competing technology has come out of Singapore?
Not at this point, but the focus of the Singapore government, not just on financing, but actually encouraging the localization in Singapore with their tech hubs and things like that, it's possible.
Yes.
I mean, we certainly have competitive technologies coming out of other parts of the world, so I would think that Singapore would be a very rich place for that.
Yeah. I'm going to go back to first to our online audience. We've got about 9 minutes left, and so maybe I'll take 2 more questions. But this is a very interesting one, and we talked a lot about the using Singapore as a hub, and you can expand to other markets. I got a specific question from the online audience. Is Singapore a viable jumping-off point for markets like China and India in particular? It's an interesting question because it's a very different market dynamic. But how would you look at that, using your platform in Singapore to jump into those very, very much larger markets?
Well, the last time I went to India, I had to go through Singapore to get there, so there's a natural locational advantage. I think with regard to China, we found more connectivity through Hong Kong. So I think for China, Hong Kong's probably a closer sort of jumping off point, but certainly for India, I think Singapore is geographically useful and also provides a lot of the capital into the Indian sort of startup market. So I think there is an alignment there. I think if I was doing a joint venture with an Indian company, Singapore might be a good kind of legal hub to base it out of rather than an Indian-based contract. So I think there's some advantages there. Yeah.
Excellent. Del?
I think that when I go back to the comments I made in the beginning about exporting, it depends on your strategy. And I think for Cochlear, we had a strategy where Singapore was not part of our first market. So therefore, as a jumping off point, we were already in China before we really established this, the entity in Singapore. So, and the same we had a well-developed distributor network in India. So I think it's a bit about history and about your original strategy.
Okay, very good. I think we had a question from the gentleman in the audience.
Hi everyone, it's Tony Huang from consenting.com. We're providing the platform for the patients and doctors' consent before they doing the procedure.
Yes.
So I got questions about the regulatory down in Singapore. I know TGA is Australian one. Do they have a similar kind of like that? And what are they follow? So are they follow the CE European model or the American FDA model?
Janice, do you want to take that, or maybe I'll ask, if not, then I can ask Del or John to answer that question. Janice, the question was on healthcare equivalents of the FDA, et cetera, in Singapore. What are those agencies? Maybe I'll come back to maybe.
I can jump in. I mean, my experience has been that Singapore has its own regulatory body and its own regulatory pathway. However, data from Australian approvals is well regarded. We've certainly had reasonably encouraging feedback when we've looked to present TGA approved products. CE mark, our products are CE marked as well, so that's part of the sort of aggregated evidence that we provide. But certainly if you were an Australian exporter with a Class 2 or Class 3 TGA approval, I think that would be a very good starting point for an engagement with the Singaporean regulator. They're also quite quick compared to some, so I think the time to market's reasonably efficient. Certainly, if you compare it to Chinese FDA, it's much shorter. So I think there's a pathway, but it's not hugely problematic.
But it is an independent regulator. So it's not something where you can springboard absolutely and say that it's been approved here and therefore Singapore will approve it automatically. There is a separate pathway.
Great. I might just ask my own question, which is something of much interest from my perspective, which is the use of AI in health technology. Because it's gaining, I think it's gaining a lot of steam here in Australia, and the application of AI in many different things, not just in healthcare. But from a health tech or med tech perspective, can I ask the two of you to just comment? Are your companies using AI technology now with your products?
We're certainly developing it, and there's a lot of interest. We have a lot of research going on. We have a very significant investment in R&D, and AI is part of that.
Okay.
I think software more broadly is becoming fundamental to any medical service. I think telehealth is here to stay. It's transformative. Yes. I think AI is going to only add to that. I think predictive medicine is going to start to take over from sort of reactive medicine. I think pre-symptomatic treatment is going to be the future, and AI is critical to that. And I think home health is a large part of that as well. And the US home health is now the fastest growing sector. I think Australia's playing catch up, but ultimately that's where the market's heading. And I think companies that have solutions that preempt that and support that are going to be the ones I think doing well long term.
Yes.
And the only challenge will be is how do regulators view it versus more conventional products, even more conventional connectivity software, and then how do payers look at it?
Yeah.
That will be their unanswered questions, and those who get there first will be the guinea pigs for that.
And the challenge for innovators is the regulators are typically 3 to 5 years behind new product development. So the FDA are only really coming to terms with apps now. They haven't quite gone to AI. I mean, there's a delay between products coming to market and the regulators getting comfortable with how to manage that.
Right. Understand that point on lead times. Janice, would you like to comment also on those trends, particularly AI? Is that an emerging trend you're seeing in MedTech in Singapore?
Yes, Miko. So in Singapore, we are actually experimenting with AI in terms of helping to actually deliver certain care. Because I think the greater trend that we spoke about earlier is that there is aging population. So we are trying to do more with less. And in terms of healthcare workers, there is also, I wouldn't say a shortage, but there is a limited number of healthcare workers. So the Singapore government is actually trying to pilot solutions for AI as well as robotics to actually focus on things like, for example, elder care. So definitely that is in progress. And you're right that regulation is also working hand in hand to actually, because the regulation is not very clear now about how to regulate these emerging technologies. So it's actually ongoing. And I would say we are actually taking a more forward-looking approach to first create some regulatory sandbox to test these solutions.
Excellent. So I think that will be the last question we will have for today's panel discussion. Just to summarize, I think first of all, I'd like to thank our distinguished panel and Investment New South Wales in discussing this very interesting topic of MedTech opportunities in Singapore. Just to summarize, I think we heard a lot about key considerations when exporting to markets, obviously with Singapore as a focus market, and we heard a lot about the merits, the arguments for exporting MedTech devices or technology or products into the Singapore market. We heard about the benefits of Singapore as a hub in ASEAN or the Southeast Asia region, and using that as a jumping point to go into other markets. Merits like transparency, government policy,
capital introductions, et cetera, not only in Singapore, but how that is amplified when it goes into ASEAN is a key point also for looking at the medtech sector in that particular market. I would like to thank all of today's speakers, Carla Lampe, our Director of Global Markets for Investment New South Wales, Janice Goh, who joined us virtually from Singapore, the Trade and Investment Director for Investment New South Wales in the country, Dale Kingsford-Smith, the Vice President for Medical Affairs, Market Access, and Government Affairs for Asia Pacific for Cochlear. Last but not least, also a big thanks to John Kelly, founder and CEO of Atomo Diagnostics. I would encourage all participants to complete the survey, which will be immediately available at the end of the event and emailed after the event. Please provide us with feedback. This is how we get better on holding these events, and particularly on the content and the topic and the format, of course. So anyways, big thank you again to Investment New South Wales for our partnership in delivering this event, and thank you everyone for joining. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.